Most people think relationships die from betrayal, from screaming, from cheating, from obvious emotional destruction. But most emotional attraction doesn't disappear dramatically. It fades quietly, slowly, almost politely. And the terrifying part is, most people don't even notice it happening until they're already emotionally starving inside something that used to feel intense. Because comfort has a strange effect on people. The moment someone becomes emotionally certain they won't lose you, they often stop looking at you the same way. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Just gradually. You notice it in small things first. The delayed replies. The reduced curiosity. The shorter reactions. The way conversations start sounding procedural instead of emotionally alive. You begin talking more just to keep the atmosphere from feeling empty. And that's usually where emotional imbalance begins. Because tension is what makes people emotionally alert. Uncertainty sharpens attention. Distance increases awareness. Possibility creates emotional energy. But comfort slowly removes observation. People stop noticing what feels permanently available. That's why someone who once stared at you like you were emotionally addictive eventually starts scrolling while you're talking. And the disturbing part is how subtle the transition feels. There's no official moment where attraction announces its disappearance. No warning. Just tiny emotional reductions repeated over time until one person slowly realizes they are no longer being experienced the same way. You notice enthusiasm disappearing first. Then responsiveness. Then emotional curiosity. Then eventually, your presence stops changing the emotional atmosphere at all. That's the part people struggle admitting out loud. Because nothing destroys confidence faster than realizing someone adapted to your existence. You start remembering how they used to react to you. How they used to notice tiny things. How they used to initiate conversations. How they used to sound emotionally awake around you. And now you feel relieved over basic attention. A fast reply suddenly feels meaningful. Simple affection feels unusually important. A small compliment feels emotionally overwhelming because scarcity changes emotional value. That's when attachment quietly becomes humiliation. Because the more emotionally deprived someone feels, the more powerful small amounts of attention become. And people rarely notice how much emotional power they've lost until they begin overvaluing things that once happened naturally. You start rereading old conversations late at night. Not because you miss the words. You miss the emotional intensity hidden inside them. You miss feeling psychologically noticed. That's what people actually become addicted to. Not always the person. The feeling of emotionally affecting someone. And when that reaction disappears, people begin panicking internally while pretending to remain emotionally composed. You tell yourself they're just tired, busy, distracted, stressed. But deep down, something already feels different. You can feel it in the pauses. In the reduced emotional energy. In the way they stop asking deeper questions. You notice conversations becoming updates instead of experiences. And eventually you start monitoring tiny things you once ignored completely. How long they take to reply. Whether they viewed your story. How emotionally expressive they sound with other people. Whether they still laugh naturally around you. You start studying emotional behavior like survival depends on it. Because emotionally uncertain people become hyper-aware. Especially when comfort starts replacing tension. That's when people slowly stop recognizing themselves. The frightening part is how attachment changes personal dignity. You begin accepting emotional behavior you once would have immediately rejected. Ignored messages become understandable. Emotional inconsistency becomes forgivable. Lack of effort becomes temporary. Not because it doesn't hurt. Because losing the connection feels worse. So people start shrinking themselves emotionally to maintain proximity. They speak more carefully. Suppress reactions. Pretend not to care. Act emotionally detached while internally overanalyzing everything. And the more someone fears emotional loss, the more unnatural they become. That's why emotional desperation feels so psychologically unattractive. Not because caring is weak, but because fear changes behavior. People stop acting naturally once emotional reassurance becomes necessary for stability. You stop expressing yourself freely. Now every interaction feels strategic. You reread messages before sending them. Debate whether double texting looks desperate. Pretend to be less available than you actually are. Wait before replying so you don't appear emotionally invested. The relationship stops feeling lived in. It starts feeling managed. And eventually the emotional atmosphere changes completely. Because attraction often depends on emotional tension people barely notice while it exists. The possibility of loss. The uncertainty of access. The unpredictability of attention. Once everything becomes emotionally guaranteed, something inside the dynamic often weakens. People stop chasing what feels permanent. That's the uncomfortable truth most people secretly experience but hate admitting. Comfort slowly removes urgency. And urgency is emotionally intoxicating. That's why people suddenly become more emotionally attentive once distance appears. A delayed reply suddenly creates curiosity. Withdrawal creates awareness. Silence creates obsession. People notice absence faster than presence. And sometimes that realization emotionally destroys someone. Especially when they realize their value only becomes visible once they emotionally disappear. That's a devastating thing to feel. To notice someone becoming more attentive the moment you stop trying. To realize emotional availability reduced your impact more than your flaws ever did. And the dangerous part is how this slowly reshapes identity. You begin measuring your worth through reactions. You feel attractive when they seem engaged. Replaceable when they seem distant. Important when they initiate. Forgettable when they don't. Your emotional stability starts depending on someone else's level of attention. That's when attachment becomes psychological dependency. And most people don't notice the damage until much later. Because emotional starvation changes perception. You start celebrating bare minimum affection. A good morning text suddenly repairs your entire mood. One emotionally warm conversation gives temporary relief after days of quiet distance. And that relief becomes addictive. Not because the relationship feels healthy. Because inconsistency intensifies emotional craving. Predictable affection feels calming. Unpredictable affection feels consuming. That's why emotionally unstable dynamics often feel impossible to leave. The emotional highs become stronger precisely because the lows exist. And comfort kills tension partly because certainty removes emotional adrenaline. No mystery. No risk. No emotional instability. Just familiarity. And familiarity slowly reduces observation. You stop hearing the clock after living beside it too long. People do this emotionally too. Someone who once emotionally overwhelmed you eventually becomes psychologically background noise. Not because they lost value. Because the mind adapts frighteningly fast to emotional consistency. That's why some people feel emotionally invisible inside relationships that technically still exist. Nothing dramatic happened. No explosion. No betrayal. No official ending. Just reduced emotional awareness repeated quietly over time. You notice it during moments that seem insignificant. They stop looking at you when you speak. Their voice sounds more alive around strangers. They react faster to other people's messages. They become emotionally energized everywhere except with you. And suddenly something humiliating begins forming in your mind. Maybe they were only intensely interested before they fully had you. That thought destroys people internally, because it forces them to question whether love was ever separate from tension in the first place. Whether emotional certainty quietly killed fascination. Whether predictability weakened desire. Whether being emotionally available reduced psychological impact. And once those thoughts begin, people start changing themselves, trying to recover old reactions. They become more attractive, more agreeable, less emotional, more patient, less demanding. But the painful part is this: the harder someone tries to recreate natural attraction, the more unnatural the connection starts feeling. Because forced emotional energy always feels different from spontaneous emotional tension. You can feel when someone is trying to recreate something that used to happen naturally. And deep down, that realization feels terrifying. Because it means emotional chemistry may not have disappeared suddenly. It may have simply adapted to certainty. That's why some people stay awake rereading old messages from years ago. Not because they can't move on. Because they're searching for evidence that the intensity was once real. They want proof they were once emotionally powerful to someone. Proof they once changed the emotional atmosphere simply by existing. Because losing emotional impact damages identity in ways people rarely discuss openly. You stop feeling magnetic, desired, psychologically significant. You start feeling emotionally ordinary. And becoming ordinary to someone who once intensely noticed you creates a very specific kind of loneliness. Especially when they still technically remain in your life. That's the cruel part. Emotional distance hurts differently when physical access still exists. They're still there. But the emotional tension is gone. So you start mourning reactions instead of people. The way they used to look at you. The way they used to anticipate your presence. The emotional urgency that used to exist naturally. And eventually you realize something deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes people don't miss you when you're constantly available. Sometimes they only emotionally feel you once access changes. That realization alone has emotionally destabilized millions of people. Because it exposes something frightening about human behavior. People emotionally adapt to consistency faster than they admit. And the moment someone stops fearing your absence, attention often changes. Not always intentionally. Not always consciously. But enough for people to feel it. Enough for relationships to slowly become emotionally quieter. Enough for one person to start feeling invisible beside someone who once made them feel unforgettable. That's when the overthinking becomes relentless. You begin searching for emotional proof everywhere. Tiny tone shifts. Shorter replies. Reduced enthusiasm. Different energy. You study patterns trying to identify the exact moment emotional intensity changed. But most people never find the moment. Because comfort doesn't kill tension instantly. It suffocates it slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Until one day you realize you miss how someone used to notice you more than you miss who they actually are. And that's a horrifying realization. Because it means attention itself became emotionally addictive. Not love. Not connection. Attention. The feeling of emotionally affecting someone. The feeling that your presence changed their emotional state. Once that disappears, people begin feeling psychologically disposable. And that fear changes everything. You stop relaxing emotionally. Stop trusting naturally. Stop feeling secure in your emotional value. You begin performing for reassurance instead of existing comfortably inside connection. And eventually exhaustion replaces intimacy. Because maintaining emotional relevance becomes psychologically draining. Especially when you can feel yourself trying harder than the other person. That imbalance slowly destroys self-respect. You notice yourself waiting for reactions. Waiting for enthusiasm. Waiting for signs you still emotionally matter. And the terrifying part is how long people stay inside dynamics that quietly drain them emotionally. Because occasional affection keeps hope alive. One emotionally intense moment can emotionally reset weeks of quiet neglect. And that's usually where people lose themselves. Not in dramatic heartbreak. In gradual emotional erosion. In repeatedly accepting less emotional energy while convincing themselves it's temporary. In becoming emotionally grateful for things that once happened effortlessly. That's how emotional standards collapse. Quietly. Comfortably. Slowly. Until someone no longer recognizes the version of themselves waiting beside the phone at night hoping for enthusiasm that used to happen naturally. Because comfort doesn't always destroy relationships immediately. Sometimes it destroys emotional tension first. Then fascination. Then urgency. Then emotional awareness. And eventually people remain physically connected while emotionally experiencing each other less and less. That's why some relationships feel lonely long before they officially end. The emotional disappearance happens first. And by the time people finally admit it, the silence inside the connection has usually existed for months. Maybe longer. Because attention changes before love admits it. And that's the part people feel long before they can explain it. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.